And I've also got to give my segment of what it was like for us to cope, how we grew up, so that our children and grandchildren will have a better picture, a positive one of what contributions we made to a better life for them and maybe a little better world in which they're living. I guess I have more to say than Brother Abe and Brother Benny and Sister Florence, because being the big brother, I've been around a bit longer. All I want to do is perhaps give some of the highlights that I feel shaped my life and made me perhaps a better person, a better husband, a better father, a better brother. One thing we've always maintained, even when we were apart from each other, we've been a family, a close-knit one, and we hope that that same love that binds us together will keep all of our children and grandchildren close together in the years ahead and long after we're gone. I guess that's what this is all about, to give some memory. I made a few notes. I didn't want to overlook some of the highlights. I'll refer to them. I can't add much to what my brothers and my sisters said as far as our parents. All we can recall, amid a few good times, mostly hard work. Mom always worked at something. She was the great protector. She was made of iron. Pa somehow was always beaten down, tried to get up, knocked down again. When he worked hard, almost like slave labor, and when he wasn't working, he was struggling with all kinds of things to survive. And survival was the name of the game. Like Abe said, my brother Abe, growing up in the 30s was like a jungle. You walked 2 blocks from your neighborhood, there was another gang. And so you learned to survive early. I did. I was considered one of the best street fighters, because especially if you were a Jew, you had to protect yourself. And I had the biggest gang, and I became the leader only because I could beat up everybody in that gang. I learned early. And I had the biggest gang, I think, in what we call the Lower East Side. And what was happening, many of these people were independent, while the members of the gang, they were scattered quite a bit. And if any of them got in trouble, right away somebody was knocking on my door because I was supposedly the ringleader. It wasn't really quite that way, but I was very vulnerable. I never carried a knife or anything, but I was good with my fists, and I proved it every time. In fact, later on, for a while, I was a professional prize fighter. That's another story. I'm glad I didn't stay in that field. One of the turning points growing up, of course, I went out, sold newspapers, especially the times when Papa wasn't working. What the family didn't know, it was a disgrace for a Jewish boy to be doing that, was that I had a shoe shine box hidden in the basement of our building where we lived. And I used to go out. Nobody knew. They all thought all I was doing was selling papers. Actually, shining shoes was more lucrative. And when I used to bring home the money to Mama, why, I told her it was all from newspapers. I think she would have collapsed. She would have known I was out shining shoes like the bums, you know. And of course, to shine shoes, you had to fight for territory. Some territory considered better than others. But again, they knew I had a big gang behind me. I was a good street fighter, so I pretty well had the corners and territories that I wanted. Well, I can remember one significant period where 3 members of my gang were involved with some group up in the Bronx. I made some notes here, I don't remember all of it. And of course, naturally, they were knocking on my door, and they felt that I was involved. Actually, I'd never been in the Bronx. This had to do with hijacking of a truck or something. I never even knew how to drive. Nevertheless, they were ready to send me away to reform school as being a very bad influence. And I guess I was. However, Mama came to the rescue. You heard how she used to fight to send us to summer camps. There were various agencies. And Mom used to always go there, and one way or another got us to go to summer camps in the hot summer and off the streets. There was always some 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there. So Mom came to the judge, and she pleaded for me, oh, don't send him to reform school, he's not a bad boy, he's just a tough kid, but he never did anything really bad, never really hurt anybody. And she cried and she brought affidavits. I don't know where she got them. She went to all the school teachers, and far as she was concerned, I was a great genius. She actually got affidavits from teachers that locking me up somewhere would be a waste. And she went to a place called, well, there was the Jewish Federation in New York, which sponsored a school called Hawthorne for boys and girls, which was a mixed bag. Some who were troubled, and many who were orphaned, had no parents, but were considered very salvageable, and the Jewish Federation sponsored this, and she pleaded with them. And she brought them these affidavits from school, and what a genius I was. And they said, yeah, they could find a spot for me at this place in upstate New York. And that was a turning point in my life. It wasn't a place of confinement. In fact, it was beautifully landscaped. We each lived in cottages, so many to a cottage, with counselors and guidance people. And they had gardens there where you learned about actually raising vegetables. I never knew that later on I'd become an organic farmer, but that helped me then, gave me an exposure to things I didn't know. There was a theater project. I became involved in that. And in fact, I became the assistant to the director, Miss Savramo, who took a very personal interest in me, and she made me her assistant director, encouraged me to become involved, making scenery. I even wrote my first play, which was produced there. And that's another story, but it gave me a sense of creative fulfillment. I found that the world wasn't really all a jungle, that outside the family there were other people who cared about me and taught me to care about other people. Her husband, Barney, who also worked there, was a social worker and a labor historian. In fact, he was a scholar, and he opened my eyes to a whole new world, a different picture of history. So while there, there was a newspaper that was begun, and I became the editor of it. They taught me to type. All these things which gave me the tools and motivation to become a person. And don't forget, there I was only, 15, 16 years old. I was where I wanted to really remake the world, or maybe get a better shake from the world so it wouldn't beat me down like it beat down my parents. And I wanted to make my family proud of me. And there was these opportunities that I never had before. I found I didn't have to fight anybody. All I had to do was be better as a writer, as an actor, as a creator. All of these opportunities were given to me. And I began to get a different picture of history. I'd always been an avid reader, but now I began to read in other directions. I'm trying to, some notes here. The turning point of American history that opened up to me. There was a library there that I could pursue. I became identified in history, in American history, people like Sam Adams and Thomas Paine, and later on Big Bill Haywood, Sacco and Vanzetti, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, Emma Goldman, Joe Hill. These people were people who gave of themselves, and of the kind of people that I thought of my father. There was no union, and he worked hard, and he was beat down and exploited. And I realized my father was only one of millions, and that these people I was reading about, going back to the early American Revolution and later on the progress of labor in the United States. In fact, I was surprised to learn that May Day was an American-created holiday, even though it was celebrated around the world. So all these things took on a meaning for me. They developed my mind, my outlook, my picture of world history. It centered on Spartacus and Garibaldi and Bolivar, Karl Marx, Pancho Villa, Lenin, Gandhi, W.E.B. Du Bois. They're a mixed bag, but all of these contributed and molded my thinking. And while it wasn't completely developed, I began to see some meaning in conflicts in the world, what shaped and why some people were exploited and why some people exploited other people, and how differences between people were being exploited instead of allowing them to unite and work for their mutual benefit, to create a safer and happier world. I identified with people who were willing to sacrifice for themselves, of themselves. These were mostly anarchists, communists, socialists, philosophers who thought of themselves as part of a world movement, a better world. They were utopians. Some had dreams which seemed impossible, but they believed them. And I wanted to believe that it was possible too. And I identified with these kind of people. And in history, there were writers that I identified with who helped me mold my thinking. People like Upton Sinclair and Mike Gold and Walt Whitman, Carl Sandburg, Langston Hughes, Ring Lardner. I wanted to write like these people so badly. And I had people around me there who were encouraging me. I was there at Hawthorne School, what, maybe 15, 16 months. I say it was a place where you were allowed to express yourself. No confinement, it was beautiful. And some didn't make it. Some just took off. You know, there were no walls. And later on, I heard terrible things. But the majority, like myself, were motivated. And it was the Jewish Federation which proved that somehow, to some extent, while you want to work with others, you really have to take care of yourself too. And that's why I identified even more strongly as a Jew, as well as a human being. So today, well, later years, again, I identified with Rachel Carson and Paul Robeson and Malcolm X, Ben Gurion, Martin Luther King, Tito, Che Guevara, Albert Einstein. All these people in their own way were trying to build a better world. And it's a mixed bag, but they all made contributions to my thinking, and they still do. Today I identify with people like Cesar Chavez and Jane Fonda and Willie Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and Dr. Helen Caldicott and Linus Pauling. These are the thinkers who are not confined to their own interests, but to the world. The world is their apple. And I hope that our children and grandchildren will grow up to feel that way. In our family, this has been a guiding thread, always has been, and I hope it will be continued, because it's the greatest fulfillment. Well, back to my own youth again. After I left Hawthorne School, like I say, I think it was about 15, 16 months, but I went out there, I knew how to type, I knew something about acting, I knew how to write expressively, and I determined that I was going to learn more, even though I'd never finished high school. So when I got out, I was about, I guess, 17, going on 18. I wasn't involved in any gangs anymore. This was an element that I put aside. For a while, I went into professional fighting at St. Nicholas Arena, and kept that a secret somehow from the family, but I didn't see any future in getting my head banged in or banging somebody else, even though I still have an interest in it. I think it's a barbaric thing. I have mixed emotions about it, and in those days there weren't as much protection for boxers as they are today, but they're still getting beat up. Anyway, I got out of that. I had a succession of jobs, delivering telegrams. I worked as a dishwasher. I worked in a cap factory. For a while, my father, as times got better, my father got more full-time work. He took me into his plant. They were willing to take me. There was no union there, but they were willing to take me in because my father was getting like $3 an hour. They could pay me $1 an hour, you know. And it was a very exploitive thing. I felt this wasn't for me. And later on, I got a job as a busboy at Child's Restaurant. That was a chain of restaurants in New York. And I learned that the union was trying to organize the workers there, but they weren't having much success. And when I found out the difference between what the conditions and wages that people would get as union, what they were getting in non-union, I thought it was outrageous how exploited people were. So I went up to the union headquarters and told them, can they use me? I'm working there, and as a busboy, maybe I could help. And they put me to work right away, and they told me, you know, how to go about union organizing. And it was like a spy system, you know, because the company, the management were always hunting and sniffing out people who were agitating for the union. Well, I would go there, you know, and I'd have these pamphlets and give them out, and I would talk to people. And finally, you know, somebody squealed, you know, and I was bounced. I went back to the union. They got me a job somewhere else. Again, places like Crafts. Today, all these places are union, but they weren't then. And I went out there, and the union had a newspaper, and I became one of the editors because I already had some background in it. And I became involved very much with union organizing. This was the AFL Chain Restaurant and Bartenders International Union. And some very dedicated people, also a bunch of racketeers in there. And I got to know who were the honest, hard workers. I identified with them. And later on, we did succeed, and I had some contribution to make to that, to organizing the Child's Restaurant chain as a union chain, and everybody's wages were improved, and so forth. Well, then the war came about, and 6 days after Pearl Harbor, I enlisted in the Army, even though I wasn't 21. I had to get my parents' permission. It was a tough job persuading them. I told them pretty soon I'm going to get drafted anyway, and we have a stake in the war, and they reluctantly, they knew how stubborn I could be, so I got their signatures. I signed up and joined the Army, and I was determined to be the best soldier in the world. That I did the best I could. I became a corporal. I became a sergeant. I was sent to officer candidate school to become an officer. I resigned from that when I was told before the commissions were given out that I would be assigned to the United States in Fort Knox, teaching other officers about tank warfare, and that was what I was assigned for, because they needed teachers there, and that's what I would work at. And I insisted that I wanted not to be a great hero, but I just wanted to play a more active role in being a teacher in Fort Knox. And they said, well, the only way I could do that, I have to resign the commission, and they would send me as a sergeant with some casual company, a company that would be replacing soldiers that get killed, and someone of diversified talents. I was supposed to be a very diversified soldier with a lot of knowledge about training, about guns, about tanks, which I'd been trained for. So I elected to give up the commission about a week before graduation, and they sent me to Shenango training camp here outside of Youngstown, in charge of a company of 80 men getting ready to be trained to go overseas. That's where I met my dear wife, and I guess if I hadn't elected to just be an uncommissioned officer instead of a commissioned officer, then of course I would have gone in other directions, and I never would have had the good fortune. That's one of the good things that come out of war, I suppose. But we don't think about the good things, because there weren't. Mostly it was all tragedy, blood, and horror. But it was a job to be done. It was a war against Hitler, a war against fascism. And it would be a separate story of how I met Ruth while I was stationed here. It's a great story. It's a love story. I stayed overseas. I was in the Army 4 years, 2 years overseas in the China, Burma, India theater. Then when we came home, we got married, and we lived in New York. After we got married in Youngstown, we came to New York, and oh, I should mention, very important, while I was in the service, I took correspondence courses during the latter part of the war, during the final year, with the University of Oregon in journalism and creative writing. And the credits that I received, I got very high grades. It was tough even by correspondence because they were very diligent about that. But those extra credits, it helped me get a certificate of completion from Seward High School, because I'd only had 2 years of high school. So with the extra credits I got while I was in the service by correspondence, as I said, with the University of Oregon, I did get a certificate of completion from Seward. And then after the war, shortly before we got married, Ruth and I, after going back to New York, back home, I applied to Columbia University for the courses in journalism and creative writing and other facts, so I could get the various credits that I would need. And I brought them my certificate from high school. And at that time, I know it will sound amazing today, there was a quota system at Columbia University where only so many Jews, so many Negroes, so many Hispanics. This was kind of unofficial, but it was there, and they had their full quota of Jews. Now, in New York, this is the city of New York, you see, that's incredible. But that's what existed, and I was frankly told that the quota was filled. I protested about that. I went back to the union, which had offered me jobs there, and I worked for the union welcomed me back, and the union had connections with two politicians who were very active in New York on the city council. One was a close friend of LaGuardia, the former mayor of New York. That was Vito Marcantonio. He was on the city council of the American Labor Party. The other was Pete Cascioni, who was a communist councilman. In fact, he was the only one they ever had. He was elected there. And these two people complained to Columbia University this was unfair. So I was called in by the registrar, and they told me that they would permit me if I would pass a specific entrance examination, and if I reached a specific high grade, they would let me in with an extension of the quota. And I had a few weeks to prepare for this test. Well, it was one of these tests where you don't know what they're going to ask you. It's just general academic. And I almost memorized the Encyclopedia Britannica. I locked myself up in a room. I explained to Ruth, you know, wait, let me get into Columbia. Then we're setting a date to get married. She knew we were going to get married. And I studied hard. Finally, the big day came. Weeks later, my head was so full of figures, I hoped I could recall everything. These were think questions as well as memory questions. And, well, we don't have much time in this discourse here, but the net result was, and I hope my children and grandchildren, I know my family will be proud, I got the highest grades when it came back within the top 2% that had ever been achieved in they told me, in 8 years of these entrance exams at Columbia University. So my family was proud. The net result was I was accepted, and under the GI Bill, so they self-subsidized the cost of going to college at Columbia, and I did take these courses, and I excelled in all these grades in journalism and creative writing and related courses and so forth. Meanwhile, so we got married. We lived in New York in a succession of different homes, because we didn't have a home of our own, lived different places. That was a nightmare, but we had each other, and that sustained us. I worked hard, going to school. It was evening courses, and then in the morning I worked 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd work till 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then grab a subway and get up to Columbia and take 4 hours of courses in the evenings. And this went on for quite a while. And then when Jeff was born, when Ruth was pregnant with Jeff, she could only work for so long a time. She worked right up, I think, till the 8th month of pregnancy. She was working as a general secretary and switchboard operator to sustain us while I was working as a short order cook and waiter. The union was a big help to us, but there was a limit to what we could do. And after Jeff was born, I had to give up going to college, but I had the benefit of all the training that I'd had, and I continued working with the union and organizing, and then finally we found a place of our own through the State Placement Bureau. They found us a home, one-room home, but it was home out in Brooklyn and Manhattan Beach, near Brighton Beach. It was happy days for us seeing Jeffy grow. And then we moved to Youngstown, where I became involved in the furniture business as a salesman, and later on we got into the health food business, and it gave me another way of doing what I thought was important for the world, helping people find their health. I became active, as some of you already know, in the health food industry. In fact, I became the national president of the trade association. I'm still in that field, still writing for health food magazines, still lecturing. We have a health food store, we have weight training equipment, but we haven't lost our roots. And the only thing I can wish, I guess, for our children and grandchildren, as I said, I think at the beginning, is that they enjoy the love that we have as brothers and sisters here who have made this documentary. Because even when we've been apart, there's nothing we wouldn't do for each other. It's given us strength, and I love my brothers and my sister and their children, and I hope that their children and grandchildren will have the same unity of family. So we think of the jungle that we grew up in, but we remember today, even though we're better off, we have our health, and we have security, there's still a jungle outside where many people don't enjoy this. And this is the greatest thing we can do, is to try to make our corner of the world a little better for those in the jungle outside. I like to quote, and I've said it many times, and I hope our children will make this, and our children will make this their guidepost. And that's what we learned from this Ohio educator, one of the people that I admired. It was Horace Mann. He said, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." So with that message of love, I join my brothers Abe and Benny and my sister Florence. Though it's been some months since they shared their part, we're still here together. And in fact, tomorrow, my sister and I, with Ruth and her sister Gladys, will be driving to New Jersey, where we'll see Brother Abe. We wish Benny would be with us, but there are occasions where we all get together, and we'll look for that. Meanwhile, we're grateful for our children, for our grandchildren, and we look only at the wonderful things that life has given us. And we hope, as I say, that someday, after we're gone, that our children and grandchildren will look at this documentary and they will say, well, these were great parents that we had and great grandparents, and we want to also give that kind of love to our children and grandchildren too. And that way we'll continue a whole chain which spells love and fraternity and sorority and peace and goodwill for a better world. Thanks for listening. I'm glad I had my share of this.